Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today I have a little recommendation video for you, which I haven't done in a while and I'm really quite excited. The reason why I had this idea for this video is that while I did say in my end of the year book tag video that I'm not a seasonal reader, which still is true, I do think that there are certain genres that maybe fit certain moods quite well. And so a few days ago I was cycling with my dad in the woods and it was like so beautiful. It was foggy and misty and sometimes the sun shone a little bit through and the trees, the leaves were all colors and it was so beautiful. I did upload some pictures on Twitter, but I will also put one right here so that you can see what I mean. Now, this mood on that day just really reminded me of everything magical and whimsical and kind of like fae-esque, fairy-esque fairy tales. And so I thought it'd be a nice idea and it'd be fitting for the mood for the season to share with you my favorite retellings. Not just the fairy tales, but in general, my favorite retellings. And so that's what today's video is. Now, I am quite particular with what I consider a proper retelling. I have hinted at that already once or twice, I think, on my channel when I talked about some retellings. And that is that I kind of need two things to be met for me to consider a retelling a proper retelling and a proper good retelling. Sometimes it's enough if just one of the two is there, but the best ones just fit both. And actually a lot of YA, especially retellings, do not really fit into the category of retellings for me. I still call them retellings because it's just easier like that than explaining why I don't consider them retelling every single time. But yeah, I'm just really particular when it comes to my retellings. And the first of those categories is that if I have a retelling, I want the story to kind of meet the same general beats as the original. And that is actually already where a lot of YA fails. And what I mean with that is that, for example, when you have Cinderella is Dead, which I generally call a Cinderella retelling, you actually do not really have the Cinderella story in here. The thing this actually does is that it uses the story and the fairy tale of Cinderella as a starting point to then tell its own story. Very similarly also Spinadon. This is generally talked about as a Mulan retelling. However, it mostly just takes the story of Mulan or the concept of Mulan. The concept of a daughter who dresses up as a man to save her father, and then this book tells its own story. So, like, are those retellings, aren't those retellings? I personally don't consider them like true retellings. Because for me, when it comes to a retelling, it's less important that I don't know what the story is. For me, it's more interesting that I have a familiar story and this story is then reimagined into something new. Be it that it's written from a different point of view, be it that the focus is on a different character. Whatever it is, it just, of course, has to have something new, but it's not that much that the story itself and the story beats themselves are new. And then the second thing that I want a lot in retellings is that it kind of has to fit the vibe of the original. I want to kind of get this whimsical vibe a lot of times, especially when it comes to fairy tales or whatever is like important in the original. When it's like Greek retellings, of course it's something different than with fairy tales, and that's something different than if it's like a retelling of a classic or of a book. And what I mean with that is that when it comes to fairy tale retellings, I'm less fussed about the story kind of fitting modern standards of storytelling, but what I want much more is that it just maybe feels a little bit old-timey, maybe it's a little bit whimsical, maybe it can be repetitive, because a lot of times fairy tales are quite repetitive and you have very like strict structures when it comes to fairy tales, when it comes to like going on a journey in a fairy tale and so on. And so yeah, that's the second thing that I want. I just want to get this, like, especially when it comes to fairy tale retellings, much more than any other retelling, I just want this whimsical vibe. And so yeah, now that we have the long introduction out of the way, what I consider a good retelling and what I wouldn't consider a good retelling, let's talk about some books. And I do very quickly have some YA recommendations here for you that maybe I personally wouldn't exactly consider a retelling, however, that are still books that I very much enjoy and that are published kind of with the thought that they are retellings. First, let's have a book or a series that I have already talked about, and that is Spinadon, or The Blood of the Stars duology. Actually, there's a kind of spin-off coming out. I think it's called The Seven Cranes, which is also a fairy tale retelling. I think that's coming out in 2021. We just recently got the cover reveal and it's absolutely beautiful. But anyway, as I said, this is considered a Mulan retelling, although there are different other fairy tales woven in here as well. For example, the fairy tale of the three dresses. I do not remember like what the fairy tale is called. I know that this fairy tale exists in multiple different cultures. I have come across it like in different collections of fairy tales from all over the world. But this follows Maya, who wants to be a tailor. However, because she's a woman, she cannot open her own shop. Now one day her father, who was a very famous tailor, gets invited to a competition to attend to become the next royal tailor. Because her father's hands are not what they used to be, however, he would never be able to like participate in that competition, so Maya dresses up as a boy and goes in his stead. I really enjoyed this duology. This doesn't really meet either of the two categories I have for fairy tale retellings, but nevertheless it's just a great YA high fantasy duology, so if you're into that, I can definitely recommend it. Then I have To Kill a Kingdom by Alexandra Christo. This is a Little Mermaid retelling, but again, it's just very barely a retelling, aside from the fact that you have a mermaid and you have a prince. That's all you have from the original, and the mermaid saves the prince at one point. But anyway, this is a dual perspective YA story. On the one hand, you have a mermaid who has to kill princess every year on her birthday. However, one day she's cursed with legs, and so she has to get the heart of a very specific prince to get her fins back. But like literally get the heart, like rip it out of his chest. And then the other perspective, of course, is said prince who has sworn to kill all mermaids, or sirens as it is in this book. And so it's a hate to love YA romance. It's very fun. It's like not too deep, but for what it is, it's perfect. Next, I have two YA retellings where I'm not all that familiar with the original, so I cannot say how much it fits like the retelling category that I have. The first of those is The Gwenevere Deception by Kirsten White. This is the first book in the Camelot Rising series. Book 2 is gonna come out in November, and I'm very excited for this. This follows Gwenevere, except she's not really Gwenevere. She's kind of a changeling, something. We don't really know what she is. And she is sent by Merlin to Camelot to protect Arthur. And we're kind of like along for the ride, kind of trying to unravel some mysteries. I know that this doesn't really fit like in the second category of the vibes, because this very much has typical YA vibes. However, I do not know how closely it fits into the first category of like my retelling thing, how closely it follows the Arthurian legend, because I have not yet read any Arthurian legends in their original. I know that there are some stories from the Arthurian legend. How often can I say Arthurian legend right now? Well, anyway, there are some stories that appear in this book. However, I think they're kind of mixed up and jumbled up and sometimes like pushed together a little bit. So yeah, but I really enjoy it and I can recommend it. Next, I have a book that does follow the second category of definitely giving me all the fairy tale and legend vibes, but I'm not really sure how closely it follows the original text, and I think it's like inspired by multiple mythologies, not mythologies, but multiple legends, and that story is Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is a Mayan mythology inspired story, and we follow our main character Cassiopeia, who one day opens this box and accidentally frees the Mayan god of death. now she is bound to him and has to help him regain his kingdom, and for that they have to like journey to different parts and they have to get back his body parts, and it's like this travel throughout Chess Age Mexico. And I really love this story, and I think it's very much written like a fairy tale, like a legend, in a point where sometimes it can be a bit predictable, sometimes it can like seem boring because it seems like it's the same story beats over and over, as it is often in fairy tales. However, I found that in here there's a lot of subversion of tropes, a lot of subversion, not necessarily of like modern story tropes, but of like fantasy tropes, and kind of playing with the concept of storytelling and of traditional storytelling and of characterization in storytelling. And I really enjoy that, and I can highly recommend this book, which even if it isn't like a close retelling of any one story, I do not know, because sadly I'm not familiar with Mayan mythology, even if it's not that close to one specific story, it's still a beautiful retelling that just gives me the vibe that I want from a good retelling. Next, I have a book that might be kind of like counterintuitive, and that is the first book in the Witcher series, The Last Wish, which is a series of short stories. And while I'm not enjoying the Witcher series too much right now, I did really enjoy this first book of short stories. And in this book, actually each short story is kind of a retelling of a classic European fairy tale, just with like more monsters. And I did really enjoy that, and I did really enjoy like this subversion, this like kind of making the fairy tales dark. And I accept this as dark fairy tales, because usually when you have like dark fairy tales in books, there's still like retellings of the Disney versions of fairy tales, which by the way is another sore point for me when it comes to retellings. I do not like retellings of the Disney versions. Give me retellings of the originals, of the bloody originals, and then make them even darker. And this is what this does, and it doesn't really give you the vibes that you get from fairy tales. However, I still really enjoyed it, and I can highly recommend it. Next, I have Daughter of the Forest by Juliette Marillet, who, whether her books are retellings or not, still always manages to get that fairy tale vibe into them, at least for all the books that I have read of hers so far. And this is a retelling of the fairy tale of the Six Swans, which, by the way, exists in so many different mythologies. In fact, Elizabeth Lim's new book, like The Six Cranes, I think is pretty much exactly the same fairy tale, but just from another part of the world. And in this story, we follow Sorka. She is the 7th child of her father and has 6 older brothers. Now, after her mother has died, her father marries again, and this new woman turns out to be a sorceress who turns her 6 brothers into swans. And to be able to turn them back again, she has to spend years and years in silence, not uttering a sound, while knitting them shirts made out of nettles. And so, yeah, that's what she does, and that's the story. And this is one of my favorite books of all time. I have read it so many times, and I'm definitely due for a reread. It's just beautifully written, it's beautifully told, and it's just the perfect retelling. Let's move on to some more myth retellings. First, I have like the queen of myth retelling, Madeline Miller. Both, of course, Circe and The Song of Achilles are 2 of my favorite retellings of all time. They are both retellings from Greek mythology. The Song of Achilles, of course, is a retelling of the life of Achilles as well as his relationship with Patroclus, and I absolutely love this. And then Circe is less a straight retelling because there isn't really one story that Circe appears in. So what Madeline Miller did is that she took this character and she took the scraps we get from Greek mythology and she imagined what this character would be like, what her life would look like. And I really love it, and Madeline Miller's writing is absolutely beautiful. So sorry if the frame is a bit different, but my dad just called me. And let's stay just right away in the same vicinity to Madeline Miller, and actually pretty much with the same story as The Song of Achilles, because the next book I want to talk about is The Silence of the Girls by Pet Barker, or the next book that I want to recommend you, which also is a retelling of the Battle of Troy. However, it's from point of view of Briseis, who was a queen who was taken as a war prize by Achilles when her city was taken. And so there's a lot of trigger warnings for this, for rape, because war prizes weren't treated very well generally. And also I did recently do a video, actually that was my last video that I uploaded, comparing this to A Song of Achilles as well as 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes, which isn't on this list because while I enjoyed it, it just like isn't that top tier that I would recommend it specifically to you. And so yeah, this is another retelling that I really loved and that I actually read quite recently, as in this month. And so I can highly recommend it. The last myth retelling I have on this list, and the second to last book in general, because this list has gone for quite some time already, is The Gospel of Loki by Joanne M. Harris. I have talked about this a lot on my channel already, so I will be quite brief, but this is a retelling of basically almost the entirety of Norse mythology, but from point of view of Loki. And because of that, it has quite a humorous, quite a snarky tone, and I really enjoy it. So if you're looking for something that isn't along the typical veins of fairy tales or Greek retellings, which of course most retellings fit into those two categories, I would definitely go and pick this up. Very quickly, because I already started editing, but I remembered that I forgot one book that was one of my favorite retellings I have read so far this year, and I forgot it because it's not on this shelf right behind me, but on my shelf over there where all my pretty books are. But that book is Orphea by Joanne M. Harris, that you can barely see because it's so shiny. By the way, if you can hear something now, it's like Hannah, who is watching a series and cooking at the same time. But anyway, this is a retelling, or actually two retellings slotted into one. Because Joanne M. Harris does this thing where she uses old English child ballads and takes one or two ballads to then like weave a retelling out of them. And then this is also additionally a retelling of the Orpheus myth. This story follows a mother whose daughter died because she killed herself, so trigger warnings for suicide. And she goes to bargain with the King of Death to get her daughter back. And yeah, it's just an amazing retelling. It's so beautifully written. I have a review of this, so I will leave that link down below and up there. By the way, I also have a review of Gods of Jade and Shadow. So, and I have a review of The Song of Achilles. All the reviews I have, I will leave linked down below. So yeah, and now back to earlier Sarah. And now the last book I have is a retelling actually of a classic, not a myth or a fairy tale, and that is The Queens of Inishlia by Tessa Gratton. This is a retelling of Shakespeare's King Lear. Actually, Tessa Gratton has a second adult retelling of Shakespeare, which is Lady Hotspur, which is a retelling of Henry IV, I believe, but I just enjoy The Queens of Inishlia a little bit more, so I thought I'd choose this as my recommendation. For those of you who do not know what the story of King Lear is about, the story of King Lear follows this king who is getting a little bit like crazy in his old age, and he has 3 daughters, and he wants to determine whom of his 3 daughters he wants as an heir. To do that, he asks them how much they love him. His oldest 2 daughters tell him how much they love him, even though they hate him actually, and like they promise him the heaven on earth and everything, and his youngest daughter refuses to take part in that game, and for that she is exiled. And so this story follows these 3 characters, these 3 princesses, like afterwards, after that big incident where one of them was exiled, and there's also like kings of neighboring countries involved and so on. The thing I would say with this book is be careful and be very aware of what you're getting into, because while this is high fantasy, this is kind of historical fantasy, this definitely is not a fast-paced, action-packed book. This is very much a slow burn, kind of introspective story where you just follow these characters and how they slowly unravel. just like very much in the vein of Shakespeare, because that's pretty much what Shakespeare is a lot of the times. And so I personally really enjoyed it, but I have also seen a lot of people saying they didn't enjoy this book because they weren't expecting what they were getting into. And so yeah, that was it for this video. That was it for all the recommendations I had to give you. And tell me in the comments down below what your recommendations would be for me, because I always enjoy getting new recommendations when it comes to retellings. If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, as well as all the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where we read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman per month, will be also in the description box. And with that said, I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!